Koutou katoa, ko John Reid toku ingoa. Welcome to this edition of Water New Zealand's podcast series, Tawara o Tuai. I'm John Reid from Water New Zealand. Today we're going to talk about one of my favourite subjects, which is drought. What happens when we have dry conditions and there's a risk that demand could exceed the supply available? How do we plan for this, and what steps do we need to take to protect public health? So in this podcast, we hope to understand some of the lessons learned from previous droughts and what we can do going forwards. So as usual, I'm joined by my co-host Hannah Edmund and two fantastic guests. First is Tonya Haskell, who is Chief Executive of Wellington Water, and second is Merrick Goff, Technical Director at Water Resources Southeast, who has responsibility for planning and coordinating water resources across Southeast England. So I must admit, Merrick and I worked together closely back in 2004 to 2006 when there was a drought in Southeast England. So I've got a bit of a sort of an interest in this subject. So anyway, kia ora, Hannah, Tonya, and Merrick.
Got it, Jen.
Hello.
So thanks for joining us. And now Wellington Water has been at risk of severe restrictions all summer because of the risk of demand exceeding supply. And parts of southern England have been experiencing drought conditions over the last few years. So really interested in getting into this in more detail. Hannah, over to you for the first question.
Thanks, John. So I guess I've got a bit of history in both areas and living in Wellington now and seeing what's going on at the moment, but also having grown up in the southeast of England. So I'm interested, and I think our listeners will be really interested in what the different regions have been facing and why they've been facing those. Maybe Tonya, do you want to start us off with what's going on in Wellington at the moment?
Oh, morena tatou. Thanks, Hannah and John, and nice to meet you, Merrick. Good to see somebody else's the same problems, but on the far side of the world. So for the last few years, Wellington Water has been forecasting that at the rate of that we use water, so the amount that we consume, whether that's through people using water at home or the amount we lose through leakage, which I have to say is around 45%. So we've forecast that we will be getting close to the amount of water that we produce and treat. So this year, with leakage at 45% and some growth in the region and high consumer use, and the Met Service was forecasting that we'd have an El Nino summer, so a dry, long summer. So that made a very real risk that at some point our demand would exceed our supply for water. So as a capital city, that's not an ideal situation to be in. So we've been very public about that risk so that we can prepare people for the region.
And I think that's an interesting point, isn't it? That it's not just about the fact that there's less rain, there's all sorts of other factors that come into it, but they all play a part in that.
That's right.
In that game. Yeah. And the southeast of England, from the years that I grew up there, has a history of long, dry summers. So Merrick, what's the story over there?
Yeah. So good evening, everyone, and it's really good to join you on the podcast. So the southeast, I think it's been defined now by, typically it was always the dry winters, which were the prelude to the long hot summers, and that really impacts our sources quite a lot here because of the groundwater storage we have. So that lack of recharge during the winter really does mean that you have less supplies going into the following summer. What's also happening now, though, is that we are seeing a lot hotter summers in the southeast. So you are beginning to see that combination of dry winters leading into lack of resources during the summer, and then very hot summers with much higher demands as the external use of water increases. So the combination of both means we're seeing more frequent droughts. I've been in a practitioner, as John knows, for about 32 years now. So when I first joined the company, you might see 1 or 2 severe droughts in a decade. And now over the last 10 years, I would say we've triggered drought plans about 3 or 4 times.
Right.
And we're now, the rainfall patterns are being characterized by very, very dry months and the continuation of dry months, with the occasional blip of a really heavy downfall in 1 month where you kind of see very high rainfall, and then the following month you've gone back to being dry again. So characteristics are slightly changing from where they were, certainly back in the early 1900s. I'm not that old, by the way, but it's just there was some of those droughts were characterized by just continual. It's more like a war of attrition, so just below average rainfalls, but continually back-to-back years, and that then just reduces your resource availability.
That makes it quite interesting because it ties in with all the conversations we've been having around climate change and the resilience piece, which is going to affect us all. And we've seen extreme situations of rainfall in the last year in Aotearoa, but we're also seeing droughts in Australia, and then we've seen these drier periods of time, as Tonya was talking about in Wellington. So across Aotearoa, we're seeing it as well as globally.
And you can certainly pick that up in the southeast. So if you look at the kind of even just very simple ratios around winter rainfall over summer rainfall, and the extent of those ratios, there's a slow upward trend on them. And also when you look at some of the monthly rainfalls and the monthly maximums, there's much more divergence between those monthly rainfall totals now.
Yeah.
Even if you go back to the kind of early 1900s, you can definitely see it beginning that divergence. So climate change overtones are definitely playing a part in this now.
And that's what we're seeing here too, isn't it, Hannah? We're seeing longer, dry, hotter spells than we're used to in Wellington and the rest of the country. And then the rain, when it comes, is quite often very intense, which has treatment issues as well. But it also means it just runs off the land, and it creates its own stormwater flooding issues.
Which creates a hard perception, isn't it? It's rained really heavily. Why
Yes.
have we still got
Yes.
challenges when actually it's the
That's
type of
right.
rain or the intensity of the rain that changes that?
That's right. And I promised I wouldn't talk about turbidity, didn't I? But
You did.
it's an issue. It's an issue. You know, we have catchments in bush, Merrick,
Yeah.
and so they very quickly the water gets too mucky to be able to treat. So people think we're immediately alleviating our issues with collecting and treating, rainwater, but in fact, it's for a period of time there, it makes it harder.
Yeah, and likewise here, that really intense rainfall over the winter, the turbidities in the rivers go up, even the chalk turbidity in some of the groundwater sources now, because some of the groundwater levels are so high that they're mobilizing some of that kind of chalk turbidity that we see. And the other thing is that when you go through the droughts and the dry winters, in some of the catchments where you might have a nitrate problem, the nitrate levels reduce in that kind of dry winter. But when the rain does come through and it percolates back through the groundwater, you end up with a double hit. And so the nitrate groundwater levels go up. So absolutely agree with you in terms of, droughts isn't just about sufficiency of rainfall. It really drives you into the quality aspects as well.
One of the really interesting things you talked about, I think, is that dry winter not quite getting the recharge. It doesn't need, when we think about droughts, it's sort of long, it's the sun beating down, and actually for a lot of the time it's that little bit of not quite getting the winter recharge rainfall that you need to top up the resources, and that's the thing that really hurts us moving into a summer, so that the drought can start a long time before those hot dry days.
That I go back to the 2004 drought, John. It was that November was the first deviation from the kind of average rainfall, and the rainfall deficit just grew and grew and grew then over the next 18 months, and and it killed. It's surprising though how certain sources were really badly affected by that, and others could go through that. So I don't know what it's like in New Zealand, but I think now, when you look at droughts and how we're going to cope with them in now and in the future, it's getting that right combination of sources that actually will be the savior in terms of going through more challenging droughts.
Brings us neatly onto the next subject I wanted to talk about, which was how we plan for droughts. So be interested maybe just to get Merrick, your view on the whole water resources sort of drought planning framework that the UK follows, and then Tonya, from you, we can then maybe delve into what would you do differently, and what do you think we should be doing in New Zealand to plan better for droughts?
I'll try and do a very quick potted history. So the UK initially used to have kind of set drought frequencies that we plan to. You kind of say we're going to plan to a 1 in 50 year drought or something like that, and use some standard formulas based on in your region about what that looks like. Then following the kind of near miss with the kind of the Yorkshire water in the mid-90s and that drought in 96, the practitioners moved to a basis of looking over historic rainfall records and then planning for the worst drought on record. That was the kind of mantra of it. But of course, some records only go back to 1960s and they couldn't go much further. Others, we were fortunate in the southeast, we can go back to 1920s, and so we used to go back down to that long. So it's great for your surface water systems, not so great for your groundwater systems because they didn't quite have the same length of record. And then it was the 2004 through 2005 drought that really kind of makes you sit there and think, okay, well, we knew what happened in the past, but that history could have played out in so many different ways. And so we then created something which we refer to as the kind of stochastic hydrology. So what we did is we said the past represents one version of what could happen with our climate systems. So let's resample all that. And so we went up to kind of resampling that and generating records of over 20,000 years worth. So we just keep sampling it and resampling. And we now use that to help plan for the future. So we look at much broader range of droughts, different combinations of events that we haven't seen in the past but could happen in the future. And then we layer on top of that the climate change influence that we'll have. So we know it will continually change. It's not a stationary series. We've got a better understanding of the natural variability that we should see and a variability as it will be as we go through climate change going into the future. And that's really helped to shape our resource planning for the future and identifying potential supply demand deficits, but also the combination of sources and resources that we use to try and solve those problems. And having done all that, the drought plans then are 5-year operational plans based on your current systems and how you're going to act should one of these kind of more severe drought events come through.
There's sort of a whole framework that supports that. But here in New Zealand, Tony, you've been working through this for the last year or so in detail, and we don't have that framework. There's nothing that says this is how we should plan for droughts. And I wonder how you were sort of not making it up, but developing that as you went.
Yes. Well, and it's new for us, isn't it, in Wellington? To people here, they think rain falls out of the sky and there's always enough. So one of our challenges has been letting people know that it is a very real possibility here. There are other parts of the country that have probably got a lot better plans than us, but we've worked quite hard over the year to make sure we're a lot better prepared. And when we talk to we're just running through our long-term planning cycle with our client councils. So a lot of work has gone into what is the investment that they need to make in this space. So what follows goes hand in hand with how much our councils are going to have to tip in. So we're a 1 in 50 year protection as well. Well, that's our target. And when we plan, we've looked at all the aspects of the water supply and demand. So from we're quite limited here. We've looked for another water source, but we are bound by mountain ranges, and so that isn't really a great option here. We then look at our treatment, and currently our Tawara treatment plant, which produces the most water for the region, currently is below capacity. So we are doing some activities there and introducing a new DAF plant so that we can improve our treatment capacity there. And then water storage. So we have 2 large storage lakes. We have reservoirs dotted around the city, but that's another thing that we can do to just help the resilience over a summer. Those are all long-term activities, and there's a big lens on us right at the moment from our new regulator, Taumata Arawai. What are you going to do to make sure it doesn't turn up next year? And so then we are really in demand consumption country. So we've been talking with our councils about leakage management. And that's a tricky one, isn't it? You can go in and fix an AC pipe once, and damn well it'll pop up down a metre down the pipe, and another leak will pop up. But it is important that you actually address those, because we've got a backlog of leakage, And that's what we need to address. And we're getting most of our councils are tipping more funding in to put more into that space to at least bring that leakage down to a manageable and sustainable level, which is great news. We look at pipe renewals because that's your best medium term and it's best bang for buck, isn't it? There's also some great work going on, and we are still working through it, and we'll pull on the likes of Merrick to help us with this around pressure management and network calming. Is a new term for me, but that's around making sure that the water in the network doesn't damage the network as it's heading through. Wellington City has the topography that makes that quite hard. We have high pressure simply because our reservoirs are high. So that is something that we're going to do a lot of work on this year that we might be able to deploy a bit smarter in the next year. And then we're in renewals, yes. And all of our councils are trying to tip as much money into drinking water renewals as possible. And of course, we all know, Hannah, we've done quite a lot of work about using as much new tech as possible and able to do that in a trenchless fashion and make it really productive and efficient. We are still out there looking for an answer to be able to line an AC pipe. So that's a worldwide call, I think, isn't it?
Any bright ideas?
Because they're not just breaking for us right now. They're all aged 60s, 70s. They've come to the end of their life a lot earlier than we thought. It's a big problem for us.
Yeah, and I think that combination is the key in there, isn't it? It's not that there's one magic solution that fixes it. You've got to think about that long term. How do we plan for this? But also, how do we deal with these issues in the short term? And what's interesting is that this is one of those scenarios when it really comes to the forefront of the public's mind what's going on with all of our water assets, because it's a fundamental piece of how we survive, how we live as humans, and we all take it a lot of the time for granted. And people will have heard me say this many times, is that you turn on the tap and you just expect it to flow, but actually there's a change in mindset when you start realizing that those resources are constrained. So what do we need to do differently in that comm space? And I guess what I'm really interested in that space is the risk and the public expectation around that risk, but also how that impacts on funding and how much we need in terms of focusing on this. Because I know, as you say, Tonya, the local councils around Wellington are looking to try and put as much as they can into it, but you can't focus on one water is another part of this the debate that goes on quite frequently. So I'm really interested in the complexity of all of that, because it's not just about a technical solution here.
No, that's right. We've been under the spotlight here in Wellington. It's nice to be at the forefront for New Zealand on the investment in water space, but actually it's raised the awareness with our public around our consumption and the amount that they need to fund councils to fund infrastructure, and particularly for something like this that has been underfunded for years and now has regulatory tension of having enough water. There's a real dichotomy there. And our public in a rainy place like New Zealand have been used to it falling out of the sky, and why isn't there enough? And we've been able to, over the course of the year, educate them about the fact it's all treated and distributed and it arrives at their house safe to drink. So that's been a good message to kind of land home with people. The other thing is that the issue we have, and Wellington's still divided, there have been some amazing responses from people on reducing their consumption enough to make a difference this year, even although we're still at a level 2, which is only outdoor sprinkling ban. So you can still water outdoor, you can still wash your car, but in fact people have taken it a lot more seriously than that, and there has been a measurable drop in consumption. But a lot of people won't when they walk out their door and their Toby's leaking or there's a leak in the road. And that's an issue, right? And we absolutely understand that that's really frustrating for people to see. So we've been working really hard with the public to make sure that they are aware that we're fixing the big leaks first. If we're looking at having enough water in the network, we need to go and hit the big problems. Unfortunately, that may not be the Toby outside your gate. The other interesting thing that we have to mention at the moment that would help people value water is Wellington and the Greater Wellington region is not, we don't have residential water meters. So people pay for their water through their rates, but they don't pay for their usage through their rates. And we will never get people to value the water that they get until they see, that there's usually a good place that allows enough volume for a good family to live and thrive with water. But over that, then you will pay. And then it's made an amazing difference in places around New Zealand when water meters have been introduced. But it also allows us to monitor the network. You're talking about monitoring and measuring, Hannah. We have to rely on modelling here because we don't have all of those meters out in the network. And it's interesting chatting to people, non-technical person, right? But that's what a meter is. It's a unit of measurement. So whether or not you even charge, it is a very useful tool to have dotted out there in the network. And we don't have them here. And again, our councils have heard that and they have put money in the long-term plans for that, but that's a wee way away for us. So there's a point of tension over the next couple of years around that. Why should I save water when it's running down the street?
All those messages ring true, even in the southeast, in terms of whenever we've gone into droughts, it's been about what's the company doing about reducing its leakage. It has to lead on that comms, and then people are more willing to do their bit in terms of helping to get through the drought, and that has always been consistent. What I would say is a couple of bits. So we started the universal metering campaign down in the southeast back in 2005, and pretty much all the companies in the southeast now will end up with their customers metered. So Tony, to your point, it's invaluable data. It really is. And when you start looking at the distributions of how people use water, you'll have your average PCC, but you'll suddenly realize that it's heavily, or might be in southeast, it's like this, it's heavily skewed. So the vast majority of people are using around 110 litres per person per day. But there is a very, very long tail where people are using 3, 4, 5 times as much as that. So
Right.
it's not a normal distribution. That's been kind of one of the smart bits we've found out from the smart meters. It helps with the custom supply pipe leakage. So when it leaves the main trunk mains that you've got and it goes to the house, you can start identifying all those small communication pipes, supply pipes, and where they're leaking, because you can pick that up from the meters in the middle of the night if they're still going. So that gives you an ability to get onto some of those leaks really, really quickly and understanding. Totally agree with you in terms of replacing networks. Some of them are over 100 years old now, and they need replacing, and there's no good just patching them all the time. You're getting to the point where it's just more cost effective and longer term to change them. I do wonder now, though. I look back in the 1976 drought, and I know most of you too young to remember that one, but when in the UK there were places where people would queue in an orderly fashion for water coming from a kind of stop tap. I don't think societies will ever tolerate that now. The expectations on people, I think particularly when you start putting meters in because they're paying for something, so therefore there's an expectation that goes with that as well. I'm paying for it, therefore it should be there. I do think that it begins to change, and where we've ended up now in this latest round of plans is that we are now planning for a 1 in 500 year drought, another 1 in 50.
Right.
And that's driving the investments. And not only that, we're also trying to understand what water is required for the environment in those droughts. So it's no longer just about, is there sufficient water in the rivers? It's how much water do we need to leave in the rivers for the kind of the environment and the species, and then what's left for society after that.
Which ties in really nicely with Te Mana o Te Wai and the discussions that are increasingly happening in New Zealand around Māori, Te Ao Māori, in terms of, looking after the environment and the fact that we are one, we're all in this together, and the environment is part of the cycle of what it is, I think it's fascinating to see that there's all of this indigenous knowledge that we have in Aotearoa, which, you know, has that as a fundamental part of it, but that's the same conclusions that the UK are now coming to, which, you know, highlights the advantage sometimes we have over here.
Yes, it's a great concept, isn't it? Te mana o te wai. It turns it into one water as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know, it's an ecosystem. It's a taiao, which is a you know, an environment, rather than it just being about what's drinking water. It pulls it all together. But it does mean, and we have a similar issue, Merrick, with the te awa kairangi. We draw water from our rivers here, and there's a level below which it will impact the environment, and we consent for that. But actually, if you have the concept of the value of water, then we try not to pull on that river. It's important, isn't it? It's
absolutely, yeah. And I think, you know, this is the first time we've built in to our 50-year plans, you know, these are requirements for the environment, not only now, but in 50 years. So we fully understand that they'll need greater and greater protection, and we'll have to use less and less of the sources that are there and look to develop other ones. So, you know, we've ended up kind of with our solutions are typically saving water where we can. So it's leakage reductions and trying to get more efficient with the water, sharing what we have. So the 6 companies in Southeast, the network will become a lot more interconnected. And so the companies will start sharing water in between each other and trying to take account of some of the advantages in the geography here, because not always that you have the same severity of drought over the whole of the Southeast. Sometimes it will be drier over in our Kent area of the Southeast or this part of the world compared to the kind of western bit. So we're looking at the ability to move water around in the network, and after those 2 bits, then it's like developing what are the new sources. Now, whether that's imports from other regions, so we're using things like the Grand Union Canal to move water down through England, down into the Southeast, or whether it's more local solutions and storing water as well.
We touched a little bit earlier about risk, and I know there's something that we've looked at before in terms of once you start putting on restrictions, it's then if you are really heading towards a sort of a ground zero sort of day when you might be running out of water, how do you protect the most vulnerable? And the more and more you look at that, the harder it is to really do that effectively. As soon as you start trying to restrict business use, suddenly you're looking at people's livelihoods, and what might seem fine from a theoretical point of view is suddenly could have huge impacts on groups of people. So I don't know, Merrick, if you've been considering that at all recently in your plans, and whether, Tonya, you've looked at it at all as a risk to people.
I think yes. I mean, the short answer is yes, and the slightly longer answer is we did we got the companies together in the Southeast, and we spent one of these. I had a sprint workshop on droughts, and it was a whole week where we considered the water quality impacts, the kind of structural impacts, everything else, John. And we had the resilience people there as well. And what was really surprising is that you go through from your water resource plan to your drought plan, from your drought plan to your resilience plans, that kind of continuum. And we said, okay, so we're not too far away from day zero. How are we going to deal with it? And, we'll just put some pillow tanks at this hospital. That'll be fine. You know, we can keep them. We target key public buildings, and then you start realizing that, well, okay, but the hospital gets its food from somewhere else, and if they don't have water, they can't bring the food in, and if they can't bring the food in, then there's a patient welfare issue. You know, and then what about the laundry, and what about X, Y, and Z? So all of the buildings, you suddenly realize these kind of key buildings, there's actually a whole supply chain with them, and the water companies aren't aware of who all those supply chains are. So it ends up being a much more complex web than we had originally thought. So there's a lot of more information that you end up having to kind of collect and pick up. And also when you look at prisons, and you can't move that many prisoners around the UK, there isn't the spare capacity in the other prisons to suddenly accommodate. And so you had all that and all those things that you started considering in terms of this. So the Drought Sprint workshop really highlighted quite a few things. It also highlighted that what you don't want to do when you get to those really extremes is have 6 water companies acting independently of each other. And so it was recognised that the exec would come together from all the companies, and they'd work collectively together to work out the best way of allocating sharing resources where they could, but also there'd be moving around the tasks and making sure that it was shared between all of them, and it wasn't just down to the companies who had the bigger bank accounts, etc., could buy the way out of the problems, that it would be a truly shared endeavour between them.
What has happened here, and particularly because it's been reasonably high profile, is that we've had a much greater integration into the region as a lifeline provider. So that the work that we have done with our regional emergency management office around planning for a water shortage has been fantastic. And of course here, that doubles for in the event of an earthquake and supply is interrupted. That has had gold for us, and being able to identify there are certain areas where that are high risk because the reservoir is either high risk or the supply to the reservoir is vulnerable. We've identified, as you have, Merrick, where are our hospitals and what is their actual need, because you want people to thrive, not just survive in these situations. What we have also done is made sure that our drought management plan is available and visible and transparent. So if you look on our website, anybody can access it. So in the event there is an emergency, presuming that the internet is up, or people can go and draw on that information and make their own plans based on our regional emergency management office and the information that we provided into that with our modelling.
I mean, you've also seen it in terms of comms as well, haven't you, with the public? So you've got it at that high level, but you're also seeing it's a small piece, but people have bought the region out of rainwater butts. They got to a point where there was a wait list for it.
Moment, yeah, and isn't that great? Because that then enables our households to be resilient for whatever reason and collect rainwater. We've been able to communicate to them about using it on their garden or treating it if you need it, but it is a great thing for people to be a little bit independent in case something happens to interrupt their water supply, not just a drought.
The big takeaway for me here, which I think most people hopefully have picked up on, is the value of water and the fact that it is a precious source that we all have a part to play in looking after. And so it's not just about those big plans, which are for the future, and the extra tanks. It's also about the little things that we do, and those showers, those slightly shorter showers, they do make a difference.
Yep.
Yeah, it's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And just the way customers can behave, if they really support you, it can really help.
And the response we've seen here, which has been mostly voluntary because it's been beyond our water restriction, has made a difference in our ability to cope with the summer and how close we've got to that, in peak demand, hitting our supply ceiling. Stories of, and I then have to follow everybody's high bar. So, we have buckets in our showers now. So while the shower is warming up, it goes in the bucket goes on the garden, all that good stuff. It's amazing what people do. It's great.
Nice way to finish. Thank you, Tonya and Merrick, for joining Hannah and myself today. It's really, really, really interesting to talk to you both about droughts. To everyone listening, thank you for listening to this latest episode. We'll be back next month with our next podcast.